All right, here we are. Welcome, episode 7 of the Rent Roll podcast. I'm your host, Jay Parsons. Thank you to all of you who've made it this far through into our 7th episode, and big thank you to those who are just joining the podcast as well. You know, we are just a few days from Election Day, and I know some of you probably be happy to get that day behind you, at least maybe half, depending on how the results turn out. But I think all of us will be happy to see all those political ads off our TV channels. So, in fact, some of them, I think, watching football games with our kids, I'm like, we need a parental guidance warning on some of these. So, though in all seriousness, they do lead to some pretty good parenting moments. All right, so we got a lot to cover today. And so I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. It's not my job. But I'm going to try to walk you through a little bit about what each candidate is proposing and how it would impact rental housing providers as well as renters. We're going to have also a special guest today, David Brickman, the former CEO of Freddie Mac. And I'm going to ask him, I'm going to say, hey, let's say whoever wins calls you and says, hey, what do we need to do to build a smart rental housing policy? And we're going to get his take on that, as well as he's also working on a paper about the success story of multifamily over these last 30 years. I'm going to get him to give us a sneak peek of what's going to be in that. And I loved it because, while we certainly have our challenges, talk about all the challenges, he also just kind of reminds us that, hey, we have a real success story relative to other parts of the world, and we could refine it, but there's some good things we could build on as well. So that's going to be a great conversation. And then also a special edition of rental housing trivia. I got a presidential rental housing question for you today once we get to trivia. All right, before we dive in, I want to give a big thanks to our sponsor, Madera Residential. Please check it out at maderaresidential.com. Okay, we start every episode with, here's a chart. And this is typically I walk you through some data and talk about what it means and try to really put it into practical terms. But today we're going to do infographics instead of a chart. And I got kind of a breakdown of what the two presidential candidates are proposing on housing. And I've got some details in here, but I'm really going to focus on rental housing in particular. That's the point of this podcast. We're the rent roll. It's SFR, multifamily, and build to rent. That's what I'm really going to talk about. Now, before we get into the differences of each plan, I want to talk about the points of agreement. We don't talk about agreement enough, but there's actually some pretty substantial agreement between Vice President Harris and former President Trump on housing. Both want to provide subsidies of various types to first-time home buyers, and there's some very important differences in what they would do, but there's alignment around boosting first-time home buyers. Both are talking about removing regulatory roadblocks to new housing construction, both for rental housing and for sale housing. So that's a great thing. Love seeing this focus. Number 3 is both want to repurpose some federal lands for new housing construction, and that's a great thing as well. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this is very rural lands, and contrary to NIMBY theory, unfortunately, people don't actually want to live out in the middle of nowhere, even if it's much cheaper. They want to live in urban or suburban locations for the most part, maybe exurban, but definitely not very much rural. So that's going to limit the options. But there are some federal lands, and particularly in the west side of the west half of the country, where there could be some viable options. So that's a win. Now, on the negative side, there is an agreement also around, we're seeing more bipartisan movement to restrict single-family rental investors. And I talked about this in the last episode of the Rent Roll. So if you missed that, it's in the news section. I kind of went through an article that just came out from Politico. But also I should point out, this is more Senator Vance than it is former President Trump on the GOP ticket. But it's something that he's talked about a lot, especially prior to joining the ticket, and something that Vice President Harris talked about a lot on the campaign trail. And that is really just trying to make a boogeyman out of single-family investors, particularly institutional larger investors. And again, I went into this in a lot more detail, but that's not going to get us anywhere. They play a small role in the single-family rental market. And at the end of the day, the most important stat to remember is that in these last 8-10 years, we have added new homeowners far faster than we've added new for-sale housing supply. That is the number one reason, without a doubt. Take all the noise and other stuff out of this. That is the number one reason for the challenges today. And that's why the home ownership rate has gone up over these last 8 years. A lot of people don't know that because they just buy these headlines they see, but home ownership has been trending up over that time because of that problem. All right, now let's break down each plan in a little more detail. Now, as I do this, I want to point out, I think there's some good meaty stuff related to rental housing in both Vice President Harris's plan, as well as in former President Trump's plan for housing. But there's also, I'd say, some populist gimmicks in both as well. And at a high level, if I could briefly address the negative, on the Vice President Harris's plan, we see kind of the creating a boogeyman out of housing providers or landlords, and casting a lot of the problems on, hey, they're the problem. And on the former President Trump side, it's pointing a lot of fingers at immigrants, saying, hey, they're the reason for the housing crisis. And the reality is both are wrong. These are, I hate to be blunt about this, but these are just, they play well at campaign rallies, but they're not going to get us to real lasting solutions. And so thankfully, both do also address real lasting solutions. So I'm going to talk about some of those things. Now, on the Harris-Walz housing plan, again, big focus on first-time home buyers, and even in the down payment assistance, which is, some people like that, some people don't. Most economists prefer more of the supply side solutions, the demand side, but certainly home buyers would be a winner. First-time home buyers would be in this particular case. And then another potential winner would be smaller single-family rental investors in the Harris plan. That's because the Harris plan would adopt some legislation that would heavily penalize investors who own more than 50 single-family rental homes, and really encourage them to sell that. And that would position smaller single-family rental investors, who are the dominant share of the market, to really benefit from shrinking supply and able to have more pricing power, more rent growth. That would probably be an inflationary situation that would benefit smaller single-family rental investors. Another potential winner, low-income renters, and also, for that matter as well, affordable housing developers, low-income housing tax credit, affordable housing. The Harris plan plans to have expansion of the low-income housing tax credit program, which would be absolutely a win. Something that President Biden has also tried to do. Unfortunately, it's not gotten through Congress, but that is something that we need and would certainly be a benefit. Now, in the mixed bag category, I put most of the apartments, renters, as well as developers, investors, and operators in this category. And the reason for that is that, well, we would see the potential benefits of some more supply related to removing, regulatory roadblocks and things like that. It really doesn't. There's only so much the federal government can really do to benefit these kind of local zoning and entitlement issues. And so there's not a lot that's specifically addressing for apartments. Now, the other thing I'd also say is that, well, it's good to see encouragement for investors to invest in new rental housing supply. Some of that's going to be counterweighted in the Harris plan by the demonization of these housing providers. So you can't just incentivize investors to build housing and then demonize them once they complete the housing. Like, that doesn't work. Like, you're going to have investors say, you know what, we're not going to play that game. We're just going to invest in in something else instead of housing. And so that's why I call this kind of a mixed bag. I don't think there's going to be too big of a movement either way from that. And then I mentioned earlier, as a potential loser would be larger single-family rental investors to the plan around restricting large single-family investors, as well as single-family renters who ended up paying more because of reduced supply. All right, let's jump to the Trump-Vance housing plan. And I should point out here, there's the Trump plan is not nearly as specified, and not that Harris has given us a ton of details, but there are some meaty bullet points in that plan. With the Trump-Vance plan, I talked about this in one of our recent newsletters. You can find that at jparsons.com to go a little more depth here. But we had to do quite a bit of research to kind of look at some of the statements that are made, and also look at the President Trump's previous his term in office, and what he did do, things around. He talks about opportunity zone legislation, things like that. And he also started an initial task force around removing regulatory barriers to new construction. So there is some meat there. It just takes a little more digging. And so as you can see from this table here, most of these renter groups I put kind of in the mixed bag category. So again, first-time home buyers, a big benefit. Potential losers, single-family rental investors, as well as single-family renters, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. That's only if Senator Vance gets his way. That's not necessarily a guarantee, but that would put that in the potential loser category. And then on the mixed bag, you really have most of these other ones. And again, well, there could be some real positives around repurposing some federal lands for multifamily housing, maybe doing what we can to streamline some level of development at the local level. Again, there's only so much they can do at the federal government to move local issues. But I also want to point out some of that could be counterbalanced a little bit, or quite significantly, by if we do by some of the President Trump's policy on immigration would actually backfire and have some reduced supply that would put upward pressure on rents. And that's just because immigrants play a significant role in the home building industry. In some trades, they're more than half of the workforce. And so if you take that workforce out, especially if it's a sudden event, that would undoubtedly mean less ability to create supply. It would put a lot of upward pressure on prices to build supply, and that would obviously be a pass down to rents. And so that's why that goes in the mixed bag category as well. So anyway, there you go. There's our breakdown of election 2024 and how it can impact rental housing providers and investors as well as renters. Again, not telling you who to vote for, but trying to cut through all the stuff out there and give you a little bit of take on each of those platforms. But either way, it's good to see that housing is at least being discussed. And hopefully we can see some real momentum for rental housing policy in a way that creates more supply in this next campaign. Now, also, just last thing to point out here is that I know Vice President Harris talked about building 3 million additional units beyond kind of baseline. That's extremely difficult to do and frankly, probably unlikely to happen. But that's just because regardless of who's elected, they're walking into an environment where, especially on the multifamily side, it's very, very challenging to build new product right now. And so you're going to have some significant federal intervention of some type. And there's, we'll talk about this a little bit, David Brickman later, some of those ideas that can happen. But to get there, it's going to take a lot more than what's currently being discussed. You'd have to have some real needle movers to change the math around incentivizing new construction. And we're coming way off the current peaks in housing supply. So the next president will inherit a much lower supply environment in 2026, almost regardless of what they do between now and then, just because it takes time to build. All right. Okay, rental housing trivia. All right, so rental housing trivia. This is when I try to give you some very important knowledge for the next time you're at the bar. You can drop with your friends and really impress them with your knowledge of the rental housing market. Okay, and so this way, this week, it's again, we have election coming up. We're going to give you presidential version of rental housing trivia. The question today is, which U.S. president was not a homeowner when he was elected to the White House? All right, so we had a renter. Was it Harry Truman? Was it Dwight Eisenhower? Was it Lyndon Johnson? Or was it Gerald Ford? So I'll give you 4 choices here. So think about who that might be. And I'll give you the answer later on. Which president was not a homeowner when he was elected president? Okay. All right. Next up, in the news. In the news, this is when we dive into the headlines of the week related to rental housing and try to give you a little bit of perspective on the takeaway. So first one, it's an opinion piece, an op-ed from the Wall Street Journal. California's unaffordable housing plans. Ballot measures would let localities impose rent control and evade property tax limits. And I'm going to quote from it here. It says, Prop 33, which would eliminate restrictions on local rent control. Progressives say this would make housing more affordable, but it would do the opposite. Letting localities impose rent control would create enormous political uncertainty for housing developers and discourage new construction. The result, less supply and higher rents and units not subject to local controls. All right, so this is Prop 33 in California. If you live in California, you probably heard all about this enough, and you're probably ready to fast forward through this segment of the podcast. If you don't, I'll just briefly explain. Basically, this will be the third time we've seen a ballot measure in recent years related to trying to repeal what's called Costa-Hawkins in California, which allowed for rent control in California, but with very certain rules. Number one, it only applied to properties of certain age, typically properties that are older. And then number two, it does not allow what's called vacancy control. This is when you are able to you require the capping of rents even for the next tenant who moves in to that rental unit. And so today, California's rent control allows for rents to be capped for the renewal of the lease, but not for the next renter. Now, there's been we talk about rent control, we could have a whole episode on this. I might get too much detail here, but there's widespread alignment that the most draconian and dangerous version of rent control is vacancy control. And this is what it does. Essentially, it restricts the ability of the property owner to invest in that rental and make sure it's properly maintained because the rents are not kept up to market. And we're seeing this happen in New York with the rent stabilized program there. Properties, as they get to be 50, 60, 70, 80 years old, they have significant deferred maintenance issues. And unfortunately, a lot of them sitting vacant because the property owners put in this predicament where they can't get the rent they need to justify the cost of that investment, but also they can't get the property in the condition they need to rent it out. So unfortunately, they're taking a loss, and those units are sitting vacant. So it's a lose-lose situation. And again, don't just take my word for it. There's been ample research on this topic. Anybody who tells you otherwise is unfortunately kidding themselves. But I'll tell you what, there's already cities in California that have said they would, or at least the elected officials said they would make a move toward vacancy control if this passes. And I think a lot of it is quite earnest. It's not like it's just that they're not fully educated on these facts. So it's important to understand what's out there. Again, it's not just an industry perspective. This is well researched, and it's important to get the facts out there. And it's why voters have shot down twice. Hopefully they do for a third time. So this is a real supply choker. It's really kind of the crown jewel of any NIMBY strategy to restrict construction is to pass this version. Next headline: Are micro apartments converted from offices the answer to the housing crisis? And I'm going to read this excerpt to you from USA Today. It says, a new proposal to address the housing crisis would convert empty office space in many American cities to deeply affordable apartments for rent. The catch: in order to be so cheap, the units have to be 150 square feet at most, about the same size as an average college dorm, and meant mostly for sleeping. Living rooms, kitchens, bathrooms, laundry facilities would be shared with others on the same floor. All right, so this is something that's called SROs, or single room occupancy. Then you have communal bathrooms and kitchens, and that does greatly reduce the cost of converting office buildings to residential. Because one of the biggest costs is that when you take an office building where there's typically one bathroom on each floor, that means there's plumbing in one area. You typically have to build plumbing all across the area, drilling through concrete on each floor to add in that plumbing. This would take that away, which would reduce the cost significantly. Now, the article says the proponents believe that the apartments will appeal to a broad range of tenants: elderly residents who may no longer be able to live at home, people who have recently relocated to a new city, even governments looking for an affordable alternative for homeless residents. Now, this is where we're really getting the challenges, which is like who would live in essentially an adult dorm. And I was a little taken aback by this proposal that we could move the elderly in these. I mean, how many senior citizens do we know who would be willing to downsize? Not just downsize, a lot of people will do that, but downsize to a point where they don't get their own bathroom. I find that highly unlikely. Also, another challenge: a lot of cities don't allow SROs today, following some bans that were created in previous decades due to various challenges. And some of that could be rolled back, but it's still going to be difficult to see this growing at any scale. I think there'll be a lot of NIMBY opposition within each neighborhood for this. And don't get me wrong, I think everything helps. I have nothing against this policy or this idea of SROs. I think especially at the lower price points, but you're going to have to subsidize that, because I don't think you're going to have people paying market rate rents in order to live in that type in a single room occupancy adult dorm situation. And so for all those reasons, it's very difficult to see this being a big needle mover. Again, if we see some of this, great, but I don't think this is going to be, as the headline suggests, the answer to the housing crisis. And our third headline today, we're going back to the Wall Street Journal. This headline is, what are mansion taxes and why do real estate pros hate them so much? A look at what's behind the transfer taxes and how they actually affect local housing markets. All right, so mansion taxes or transfer taxes, what this is when you sell your property, if it's priced above a certain level, then you're going to pay what they call a mansion tax, an extra tax, which typically goes into some type of affordable housing fund or something else. Now, the problem is that, well, mansion tax sounds good. We think what you're doing when voters look at this, like, oh yeah, like let's tax people who are buying, multi-million-dollar mansions. No problem, right? But unfortunately, these laws have been written in such a way where it's really affecting a lot more. And so in places like Los Angeles, it's really restricted the amount of development and investment that can happen in that market because of the existence of the transfer tax. It takes away a significant chunk of the value of the property upon sale. And so, if, for example, if you're a merchant builder who builds apartments and sells them, you're subject to that. And if you're an investor who typically invests in 5 to 10 year window, you're subject to that. And so it ultimately does actually backfire on the cause. And we've seen this in Los Angeles, not creating near the revenue it's supposed to, just because it does complicate the math so much. And so it's one of the kind of a good example of the law of unintended consequences. It's like, it's not a bad idea. Of course, we want to have more money funded into affordable housing, but it's got to be structured in a way that's viable and does not backfire on the very folks who are trying to benefit here. Next segment, good question. All right, good question. This is when we take a question that we get over social media or from events and elsewhere and address it here on the podcast. And lately, with election coming up, I begin this question a lot. And so I put it up on your screen here. And it's some version of this. Is how will the rental housing investment outlook change based on the outcome of the election? All right, so earlier in this episode, I broke down for you the candidates' various platforms. But at the end of the day, I'll tell you this, is like, obviously, elections matter. I don't want to downplay that. But what we've seen throughout past elections is that specific to the rental housing space, it's not going to dramatically change the investment equation. Now, we've seen various proposals that would obviously move the needle quite a bit, but the chances of some of those things passing appear to be uncertain. And so I don't think the overall investment outlook is going to change dramatically as the outcome of the election. I don't think it's going to move cap rates. I think it's going to trigger, more or less deal flows one way or the other. I think there's still a lot to play out. So my broad answer here is probably not much. The overall economy and any specific legislation that comes out of this down the road is going to be far more impactful. Next up, complaints department. All right, this is when we get to take a cynical comment over social media or elsewhere that addresses a common misconception about the rental housing market and give you some facts to correct it. All right. So in the last week's episode, I addressed the topic of the misconception that when we build new housing, the view is that it can raise the cost or raise the rents for the apartments around this new product. As a result of having something new, it's more expensive. It makes everything else go up. Now, I showed you how there's been ample research showing that's just not the case. And oftentimes it's a function of just bad math. It's like, hey, we're looking at a neighborhood average or median, which typically what you see from any kind of report about how much it costs to rent an area. And they say, hey, the median's gone up by 15%. But that just could be influenced by the addition of new supply. And so, in fact, there's ample research showing that for existing supply, it's really the opposite. They could be, their rents don't go up as much, and in some cases, they go down. Well, I got this, even after sharing this, I got another comment over social media this week, and it says, they built 1,500 plus units in my neighborhood in the last 6-7 years. Class C apartments that were renting for $1,400 7 years ago are renting for $2,100 today. I agree we should be mindful of what we're measuring, just as we should be mindful it's not as simple as building more. All right, so this is the kind of the challenge with this argument. It's like every time, you have, this is one of the most researched topics in housing, the idea of filtering, the idea that when we build even at the luxury price points, it does create a benefit at the lower price points. There's really no doubt about this by anybody who studied this topic in any depth, but people always have this perception. In fact, I had one point, somebody and a mayor of a smaller city in the Northeast that made the same comments like, hey, we added a couple new and nice luxury apartment properties, and all the rent went up anyway. So clearly this doesn't work. So in this case, I went back and looked at this mayor's town and realized, this place has built almost nothing for 30 years. And so then you think, okay, we just built 2 new properties and the rent still went up. Well, guys, come on, that's not nearly enough. You can't solve the problem with a couple of properties if the challenges with the housing shortage trace back decades. And so, you still need to build more. If your rents are still going up that much, you still need to build more, especially in this era, this cycle we just went through, where we saw the strongest demand wave in 3+ decades. And we're only now just meeting that with supply. So there's no doubt that when you build more supply than demand, that puts downward pressure on rents. But that's the key. You can't just build a lot of supply and then say, 1,500 units is a lot, or 2 properties, that's a lot. No, you have to build enough supply to exceed demand. And once you reach that threshold, you're going to see downward pressure on rents. It's just like clockwork. All right, now let's get back to rental housing trivia. All right, so our question this week was, which U.S. president was not a homeowner when he was elected to the White House? And we give you four choices here. Was it Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, or Ford? And the correct answer is Harry Truman. So that's a cool little story here. Truman was living in a house owned by his mother-in-law in Independence, Missouri, when he was elected to be president of the United States. Can you imagine today in like the TikTok era running for president while living with your mother-in-law? Probably not going to happen, but this was different era, different times, different situations. And it's actually a really good story. It was his wife, Bess's childhood home in Independence. Today, that house is preserved as a historic site, and it's known as the Truman home. But technically, he and his wife did not own it until after the death of his mother-in-law. So in a way, Truman may have been our first renter elected president, even though I assume he probably lived rent-free. All right, next up, the interview. And I got a great guest this week. We have David Brickman, former CEO of Freddie Mac. It's going to be a great conversation. So let's jump in. All right, welcome back. And now we've got the interview segment of today's podcast. And I am absolutely thrilled and honored to welcome in David Brickman, the former CEO of Freddie Mac and also of New Point Real Estate Capital. So first of all, David, thank you so much for being with us today.
Great to be with you, Jay. Thanks for having me.
All right, so obviously a lot going on in rental housing, and we kind of got our most recent exchange going. As you had reached out to me, you're working on a paper about the success story of multifamily housing over the last 30 years. Of course, I'm a nerd, so I'm very excited to read this when it comes out. So can you give us a kind of sneak preview of the big takeaways from your research?
Sure, happy to. And we'll add, very privileged to be a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute, where I try to put some policy-oriented papers together. I would hesitate to call it research so much as informed analysis, perhaps. And this last paper really I came out of it was a presentation I was doing over the summer at a conference and thinking a little bit about introducing multifamily, particularly to an international audience. We're a little less familiar with multifamily as we know it here. And as I was putting it together, really struck a little bit by the success story of multifamily as a housing policy and by implication, kind of almost sort of an innovation. And by that, I only kind of add, I mean, in much of the rest of the world, you really don't have a formal institutional rental housing sector.
Right.
We do, just for what it's worth, to confuse things a little bit, may often be called build to rent as opposed to even multifamily.
Yeah. That brings a lot of confusion here in the U.S. Now build to rent.
Exactly. So not to be confused with our build to rent, we're a single family. But it does kind of tell you a little bit how they think about it, that that's kind of a novel concept to actually build dense housing units, apartments for rent as opposed to through an informal sector. But anyway, so through putting the paper together, started thinking about how successful multifamily has been, both in terms of its growth, how it's evolved, its ability to respond to market signals appropriately, and in particular, price or rent signals. And I know, Jay, you've done some great research on this. Some may look at the supply of multifamily over the last year or two and say, it's a problem. There's potential oversupply. I look at that and say, that's great. That is a great outcome. That's how we want markets to behave. We want them to respond to rent signals and deliver more supply when it's needed. And that really does seem to be how multifamily has responded. Might contrast that a little bit to single family, which really hasn't gotten back to the level of supply we saw pre-crisis, and won't go off on a tangent on that. But much of the kind of incremental positive effect on supply we've seen, and we need more, and that's clear, but it's really been driven by multifamily. I just have to ask so what's contributed to that? And, took the opportunity to go back 30 years and really spotted three things that have contributed to the evolution of multifamily capital markets, debt and equity. that strike me that have kind of led to greater capital flows, greater liquidity, ultimately a lower cost of capital, and consequently kind of a more stable and responsive market. And, in quick order, those are really the role of the GSEs, and not just they're providing a lot of capital, but also providing stability in terms of credit standards, underwriting standards, providing data. So the direct provision of capital, but also creating the environment in which more, particularly debt capital, comfortable flow, and even on the equity capital, the stability that they provide, some comfort that you don't have some of the liquidity issues you might have in other real estate sectors. The second was actually the growth of the private equity real estate fund model, which has grown tremendously, as you probably know, and is really, it strikes me as kind of almost the dominant growth form that we see. It's not the dominant necessarily ownership form yet, but in that I think has at least been well correlated with the growth of an expansion of large institutional management platforms, ownership platforms, and the economic efficiency that comes with those. And the last thing is the absence of rent regulation, and certainly see the correlation between where you have supply and where you have limited risk from rent regulation, or the inverse. And it just strikes me those three things have really combined to help make multifamily successful in the way that it has been. Not to downplay, you still have a fundamental cost issue in terms of it costs a lot to build multifamily. It takes a lot to get entitled land, and those are still obstacles to more supply. But rather, those success factors do point to ways in which we might be able to drive more supply by further supporting multifamily capital flows.
And I love that you're framing this as a success story, because so much of the focus today seems to be negative around rental housing. And it's true, though, there have been a lot of great successes, and there's millions and millions to tens of millions of multifamily renters as a result of some of the successful policy. But as we transition to today, think about history today, is there any historical parallel you can recall to today's policy spotlight on rental housing?
The best I can do is going back to really kind of prior to my adult life, which is, we did see a big focus on it back 60s and 70s, and with significant federal intervention and subsidies involved. I mean, also you go to the 80s and some of the tax reforms that kind of goosed supply significantly. Then obviously kind of with 1986 took some of those tax incentives away and kind of brought it crashing down. And there too, I'd say one of the positive things I think over this last, give or take, 30-year period is you haven't had any significant government subsidy away from the targeted programs like the LIHTC program to help support supply. And so it's come at relatively little cost. And the fact that we're able to develop infrastructure in the form of multifamily without that kind of cost, again, strikes me as a positive thing. To add a little more subsidy in a targeted fashion to where we need more most acutely, namely, again, affordable housing, then seems like a reasonable response. I think as a political statement, again, I can't speak too confidently about my own recollection even of kind of the 1980s or 70s, but that just housing is getting a lot of attention is a great thing and kind of well overdue, and a recognition we really need to think a little harder about how we want to kind of contribute to a healthier housing market, a healthier housing environment, given some of the kind of structural imbalances we've got that just continue to make it difficult to provide sufficient supply to support the growth and migration we've got in this country.
Yeah, I fully agree. There's definitely good and bad with more focus on housing, but certainly good that we're talking about it. And there's also some very smart and I think honest and well-intended people talking about this. And one of those is our mutual friend, Bob Simpson. He's proposed a national construction fund that would provide bridge financing or preferred equity for multifamily construction projects, and that could help more projects pencil out. And as it turned out, coincidentally, from kind of a whole different angle, Paul Williams, the Center for Public Enterprise, was putting together a similar proposal, and now they're working together a little bit with coming from different directions, but same idea. So does this have some legs? What do you think of this idea?
I think it is, or they are, depending on whether one or two are great ideas, and completely support both, or again, if they're separate initiatives. I've had some conversations about them. The ability to help, again, lower the cost of capital for developers in a way to kind of get the pipeline moving again, I think could be meaningful. I think the challenge a little bit is, how much do you subsidize? How broadly do you make it available? And what exactly are the requirements or the terms associated with getting it? And I think those are the important questions to work through. It can be significant if it's more broadly available, and obviously if the value of the preferred equity or mezzanine capital is that much less than market. Obviously, if you significantly constrain it, and if you put a lot of kind of burdens on receiving it, then less so. And so depends critically on implementation. And like so many things, again, the concept I think is great. It really key to be successful really could depend on implementation and ultimately execution, making it user friendly for the population of developers you're targeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let me ask you a different related question. And some folks look at this and they say, hey, obviously Fannie and Freddie today, they can't do construction lending. They have to wait till a property is stabilized. So why not just allow Fannie and Freddie to provide construction loans? Is that a better option?
I hesitate to say better option, but I think it would add significantly. And you're asking about the paper before, and I do comment in that paper. I still believe having the GSEs do some form of construction lending, particularly construction to permanent lending, would be that much more impactful ultimately on supply. And part of that is it just the GSEs can wield that much more in terms of total capital. They've got the infrastructure to be able to implement programs like this. And if you're also dealing with the senior part of the capital structure, there's just that much more ability to simplify things and lower the cost. So I see it as a natural. Would even add on top that by virtue of the fact that they are dominant players in permanent lending, doing it in a construction to permanent form means they're kind of playing to what they do every day, and actually can de-risk the structure by virtue of committing on the permanent financing. So if you think of the riskiest part of construction lending is the takeout, well, if the GSEs are kind of providing that takeout themselves directly, as well as providing the construction finance, then I think you've got something that can really move the needle pretty significantly. And I think you can do both. I think providing the preferred equity as or mezzanine finance, again, to help lower the cost of the equity capital, but then also doing doing some form of construction lending at the GSEs, I think could be really important.
Yeah, I agree. It does seem like it would streamline things quite a bit. Speaking of the GSEs, as you know, Fannie and Freddie have taken a hands-off approach on property management and asset management over the years. And that started to change during COVID with the CDC eviction bans. And now we've seen the introduction of some requirements around things like notice periods, renewals. And to be fair, nothing too crazy at all. But do you think Fannie and Freddie will become more and more active in their roles in the future? And at what point, if any, do you think borrowers will say, all right, this is just too much, and we have to look at maybe some other options that start to take a bigger market share?
Jay, I think it's a great question, and it's a really important one. I do worry that greater sort of, if you will, unfunded mandates that are part of the bargain of getting financing from Fannie or Freddie could start to push some borrowers away, and that undermines some of the potential effect. Going back to what I was alluding to in this paper is if you really think of Fannie and Freddie as being a supply side subsidy and lowering the cost of capital to multifamily, then you want it to be kind of broadly available. And of course, you want borrowers to maintain their property. So, I mean, we can point to examples that I'd say it's egregious. Absolutely, the agencies, any lender ought to be requiring them to provide basic, safe, decent housing, and levels of deferred maintenance here are unacceptable. But I think it really just depends on how far you go and what the mandate looks like, and that gets very qualitative and gets into specific properties, specific instances. But it is something that I think it'd probably be best for the GSEs, FHFA to articulate what those expectations would be. I think, and delineating kind of where those lines might be as far as what requirements would look like. Otherwise, to exactly the premise of your question, I think you start getting some folks who will kind of view there as being kind of hidden taxes associated with doing GSE financing, and I don't think that's probably helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. One of your third point earlier around the success story multifamily was the lack of rent regulation, and certainly there's been a push behind the scenes to install rent control through Fannie and Freddie, which would undermine that, obviously.
Absolutely, and I might even go to it seems a little unrelated, but in the single-family residential mortgage market, there are some lenders who won't do FHA loans, and might suggest, well, not the same exact set of issues, that same concern about potential for sort of scope creep in terms of the program does give people some pause. Nobody wants to be on the wrong side of the government on some type of compliance issue. And if you're thinking that, the rules can change a little bit on you, again, that can give people some degree of hesitation.
Yeah, for those who have not been involved with this stuff, maybe just watching, I think what maybe was kind of an underrated thing is predictability, right? You got to know what the playing rules are. Well, you got to know what the playing rules are going into the game and knowing they're going to stay those playing rules, right? Otherwise, that introduces a lot of investment risk.
Exactly.
All right, so let me ask you another final question, and I'll break it into two parts here. We're talking about problems and solutions. Obviously, there's always challenges, but we want to be solution-minded as well. So first and foremost, what worries you most about the state of rental housing today?
Well, you've already kind of touched on it. One is creeping potential for rent regulation, and various forms of that are cousins to that, whether it's direct rent regulation, whether it is some of the variations on good cause eviction. We can want to be clear. You can define some variants of that they seem perfectly natural, but others that if you start introducing rent increases as not a good cause, in which way that can trigger someone having an action under a good cause eviction provision. Well, that is then really kind of rent control through the back door.
Yep.
So I think those are the biggest concern to rental housing right now. Next is really just the fundamental economics of preservation. We have an aging housing stock. It is, as I alluded to before, it's infrastructure, and the economics of preserving old, in some cases functionally obsolete properties and renovating them to make them usable does require significant capital. And if we particularly think it's valuable to have those properties preserved as affordable, obviously we want them upgraded, we like them renovated. We have to figure out other mechanisms to be able to do that and provide, whether it's subsidy or other types of support to enable them to continue to serve the populations they serve. And I think, again, as that housing stock is aging, as those costs, unfortunately, continue to go up, I think that's a critical need. It's also where the existing program, if I'm going to focus on the tax credit program, kind of don't quite serve the need sufficiently. And even I talk about the tax credit program, obviously it's focused on new construction. It's also focused on primarily low income, and we need more low income. But the missing middle, workforce housing, lots of different terms for it, we also need significant support for, given the challenges and the really kind of decreasing amount of stock we have that kind of fits that criteria. So I think I put that next in terms of kind of problems we're facing. And the third is really just the broader issue that faces all developers, which is zoning and the challenges associated with finding and entitling land that you can actually build on.
Yeah, no, all great points. I want to go back to the second one for a minute. You brought something that just I think is so critical because again, the general public, they see these, whether it's an expiring tax credit or just a naturally occurring affordable housing and older property. And I think a lot of people understand, but you allude to this, is that the property owner is sort of put in this predicament where if you invest the capital to modernize the property to sufficient standards, keep it safe and modern, you're going to have to raise the rent to pay for that if there's not a subsidy in place. And if you don't do that, if you don't make that investment, then you're at risk of being labeled an absentee landlord who's not sufficiently maintaining their property. And so people get upset when these rents go up. They also get upset if the property is not being maintained. Both reasons to be upset. But I think we need some public education around the challenge, not just like solutions around this challenge, because it is I think a really big one we're going to face in the next decade. To your point.
Yeah, no, you put it well, Jay, and I think more we can do and bringing attention to the issue critical, and certainly again if we can bend some of the existing programs to better serve that need, all the better.
Absolutely. So let's end on an upbeat note. Let's talk about solutions and whoever's elected president coming up here soon. I hope they call you and put together a working group on rental housing and say, David, I want you on this group to build lasting solutions. And so you join this working group. What would you advise them in terms of a policy agenda for rental housing?
So I thought we were friends. Why would you wish that on me? No, love to see that challenge, and we touched on some of them already, right? And I'll just kind of break it up into a few categories. I mean, coming from the GSEs, I have views about the GSEs. I touched on some of on one of them on construction earlier. I think other programs the GSEs could do to help on the preservation side as well could certainly can have a significant impact in that space. I think a greater effort to help support a lot of the initiatives that are coming out of state and local housing finance agencies would be another. So you're seeing these types of both preservation activities, broader kind of uses of capital than just for the tax credit program out of state, local housing finance agencies, I think encouraging that. There's a number of great examples and models out there. And even those local governments who are providing tax abatements, some of the like PFC type structures that are trading some degree of tax relief for preservation, I think are notable and represent an area in which the federal government could try to provide greater incentive and encouragement. And then in terms of the tax credit program itself, I think both some expansion of it. It's not perfect, but we do have it. I'm a pragmatist and don't think you need to kind of rework the whole thing, but rather expand it out a little bit so you can indeed support workforce housing and you can support a little more renovation type investments as opposed to new construction. It is available for that, but because it's very cost driven, it isn't, for moderate investment in an existing property, it's not necessarily the most wieldy tool. So those would be a few of the things that I'd highlight. I think also some reforms to FHA to simply make it a little bit more efficient. They've got great financing, and the 221D4 program is a construction to permanent program that could could do more, also represent areas that I think could help make things work a little better in terms of housing production.
Well, I certainly don't want to wish trouble on you, but I do think it would be wise for someone to reach out to you for that. And, just one last comment I'll make is I feel like a lot of housing today is obviously we're 2/3 homeowners in the U.S. It's through the lens of home ownership, but it's so important that people involved with these policy discussions who understand, the unique needs and appeal and requirements associated with rental housing as well. So appreciate your contributions to the issue here.
Well, thanks, Jay. I mean, it's a pleasure talking with you. And I think only on that last point I can't resist, which is, look, I own a home. I don't know. I'm going to guess me right. You own a home. Many of my colleagues own homes, right? I have nothing against home ownership. It is an appropriate time, place, income for home ownership. We just, I think, have to recognize that a large and growing part of the population, particularly the population most burdened by cost, tend to live in rental housing. So if the focus is ultimately, how do we address a housing cost issue, it's primarily going to be a multifamily solution that's going to address it.
Absolutely. Usually both and homeownership and rentals, not either or. So
exactly.
That's important. Well, David, thank you again for joining us today. Really appreciate it. I know our audience did as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Jay. It's been a pleasure. Take care.
And that's a wrap for episode 7. Thank you to everybody who's made it through today's podcast. I know it's a little longer, but hopefully you enjoyed that conversation with David, as well as the breakdown on election 2024 and its impact for rental housing investors as well as renters. Thank you again for all of you for making this podcast part of your day. Keep the feedback coming. Want to make it better each week. Appreciate all of you. Have a great day. Have a great week.